Hey gang. Well, it's Friday and it's Parent-Teacher Conference Day, and so I've got a little window of opportunity where I can upload today's, or actually this week's lessons. So I still had 3 or 4 of you at home on Tuesday. One person returned on Thursday, and Thursday was a little bit of not a train wreck. I just didn't get to what I was going to get to, and it was a short class period. So anyway, I'm kind of revisiting Thursday's lesson. So it will not hurt the person that was here Thursday to watch all of this. So I'm going to try to get you guys up to speed. So we just had 2 class periods this week, and because of parent-teacher conferences. So I'm going to do a little review and then kind of fly through what we talked about this week. And we are officially in chapter 5 now. As a quick review, the end of chapter 4 dealt with the French and Indian War and the outcomes of that war, how the balance of power in the world changed drastically. The French lost a lot of power. The Spanish gained some territory in North America that kind of got swapped to them by the French. And then the British end up on top. And so as we enter that period right before the American Revolution, the British are living their best life, I guess you could say. So I've uploaded the PowerPoint. It would be very helpful for you to follow along. I've made copies of everything here. And so when you get back to school, I'll give you copies of everything. So just follow along with me. So in review, the world changed as a result of the French and Indian War. You'll notice the first slide in your PowerPoint is a timeline that reflects the French and Indian War all the way to the colonies declaring independence from the British. And so there's a lot of stuff in the middle, and I would say that a lot of the things that are in the middle are things that you probably are familiar with, stories that you've heard about, whether it's the tarring and feathering of tax collectors, the slogan "No taxation without representation," the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Continental Congress meeting, the battles of Lexington and Concord. All of these things are pretty familiar to most reasonable Americans, so hopefully you've heard of them. The Battle of Bunker Hill is another one. So we're going to talk about the events between the French and Indian War and the independence movement that happened in 1776. So follow along with the timeline. I may mention it and go back to that, reference it. There's a PowerPoint slide of George Washington at Fort Necessity, so we sort of revisited that once again. I think it's kind of important for us to understand as Americans that the very famous George Washington first came onto the scene as a young man in his 20s, land surveyor working on behalf of the British, trying to encourage the French to evacuate their forts in British territory in the Ohio River Valley, which they don't, which leads to a mess between Washington's men and the French. Washington builds very hurriedly a fort out of necessity, so thus it's called Fort Necessity, to protect himself against the French and the Indians who come back at him. And unfortunately for Mr. Washington, it's a terrible experience. He loses a lot of men. And he has to surrender. He is granted his freedom as an officer, and then the war is full on. So that 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, that it starts in North America, it expands to other parts of the world, the British Empire, the French Empire, but it actually starts in North America largely with George Washington, which is kind of funny. That should be review for you. And then the next slide talks a little bit about General Braddock. And I don't think that we talked about this the week before. So just real quick on page 162 in your textbook, it briefly mentions General Braddock's expedition to Fort Duquesne, which is modern day Pittsburgh. He and his men, his regiment, I think of about 3,000 men, I think went with him. Yeah, that's what it says. Got hijacked, not hijacked, what's the word I'm looking for? They got surrounded, surprise attack by the French and their Indian allies. and they are deep in the woods, and General Braddock finds himself in a mess. General Braddock is killed. General Braddock was, I would say, a close officer to George Washington. They had worked together. George Washington was supposed to be on this northern expedition to Fort Duquesne, but he developed a severe case of diarrhea, for lack of a better word, and was unable to join General Braddock. In some of my own personal readings, I have discovered that it's fairly common during that era. They called it dysentery, largely because water sources and other things were not as pure and clean as they are now, and so people oftentimes came down with long seasons of diarrhea, which could just kind of ruin your life. And in General Washington's in Colonel Washington's situation, it actually saved his life, because he was not with General Braddock when he was attacked. So he comes upon the attack a little bit after the fact and is witness to the butchery, the horrible scene left behind by the various Native Americans that were engaged in the battle. Washington regrets and bemoans the fact that he wasn't there to help, but honestly, he probably would have been killed, so it's good that he wasn't there. And then, so I wanted to mention that's something that I was familiar with. The book barely mentions it, but I think it's important to know. And then, again, we just kind of walked through the fact that over the course of the 7 Years' War, the British began to gain speed on the French. The French had a disillusionment of sorts with their Native American allies, who wanted to butcher those who were surrendered, didn't want to follow European protocol in battle, and so they become disillusioned with one another. And the British put more men into the fight, more money behind the armament, and ultimately, I wouldn't say, I mean, history says that the British won, but essentially the French decided to come to some peace terms. They wanted to come to the table and end the war. And so the British got a sweet deal out of it. They ended up gaining all kinds of territory, doubled the size in North America. The French gave up a lot of holdings. The French gave Florida to the British. So it was a great big win for the British. I would say that the colonists after the French and Indian War never felt more British, because they had fought alongside with them in the French and Indian War. And so, however, with the French leaving the scene in North America, the Native American populations no longer had two dueling European nations that they could play off one another. They'd become pretty good at doing that. Of course, as you know, the French did not bring in large numbers of families and that sort of thing. They were primarily merchants or fur traders that needed the Native Americans to trade with, to scout with, to discover the land with. And so the French presence wasn't nearly as threatening to the Indians as the English presence was. The English were thirsty for land. The colonists of the British colonies, although they weren't all English, they were thirsty for land. They wanted land. They were running out of land. They were nestled in between the Atlantic coast and the Appalachian Mountains, and they wanted to move further into the frontier, and had been prevented from doing that, largely because of the Indian presence and because of the French ownership of that land. And so now that the French are out of the picture, the Native Americans are like, what are we going to do? And so they were threatened by the British presence, and they were threatened by the beginnings of those colonists coming over the mountains and moving into French territory and gobbling up the land. And so the Indians fought back. The most famous of these battles or wars of sorts was Pontiac's Rebellion, which took place in 1763, right at the end of the war. The book says it's a poor name for the rebellion because it was really inspired by a guy by the name of Neolin, who was a Delaware religious prophet, is what the notes say. And he called the Indians to come back to their way of the Indian way of living. He claimed that the native tribes had become accustomed to the European way of doing things, that they had become in effect dependent on the Europeans for their guns, their ammunitions, their way of killing animals, their clothing, the structures that they use for their homes. And Neolin said, we need to go back to the old ways, bows and arrows, living off the land, rejecting the European or the white man's way of living. And he was able to corral several other tribal groups that were not from his particular tribe, created a confederation of sorts, and the book lists a whole bunch of them. I recall the Miami tribe was one of them, but probably the biggest APUSH tag type of word that comes out of Pontiac's rebellion is this idea of a pan-Indian identity, meaning initially, or up until this point in history, the various Indian tribes did not see them as any particular like people group, like we are American, or you are German, or you are Russian, or you are Slavic, or you are South American. They just saw them as they saw themselves as individual native people, but not as part of a greater Indian identity. And so it's during and after Pontiac's rebellion that we begin to see that evolve in North America in particular. The Indians began to see all of the various tribes as having the same cause, the cause of resisting the white man and the spread of the white man. And so initially in North American or in colonial history, the very fact that the Indians did not work together and did not see themselves as one people group actually greatly benefited the Europeans, because there was not a significant organization against white settlement, with the exception of maybe the Iroquois in New York and whatnot. So this changes the game significantly, especially moving forward as we talk about more of the Indian conflicts. Ultimately, the Pontiac's rebellion did have some success, killed a lot of the white settlers, scared them back to move back east. But over the course of several months and then years, various tribes broke away and made peace with the white man. And then the rebellion ultimately came to nothing. But it was I would say, the last significant resistance to white settlement, at least in that up Northwest Territory, for a period of time. We'll see this evolve a little bit again in what's known as the Ohio area, but this was a kind of a big end to a coordinated effort to stop the British. Another thing that comes out of the Pontiac's rebellion is the British are like, ugh, good grief, we have spent so much money protecting these colonists from during the war, and now after the war against the Indians. We have got to prevent them from settling into the West. We don't have the manpower or the money to continue to protect farmers out in the frontier west of the Appalachian Mountains from the Native American enemies. And so the British or Parliament passed an act called the Proclamation Act of 1763, sometimes known as the Proclamation Line of 1763. And it was essentially an invisible line that started way up north in Canada and goes all the way down south, and essentially says, colonists, you cannot go over this border into the frontier. We can't protect you. In fact, I saw or read or watched a video that talked about the fact that the British actually sent troops into the areas west of the Appalachians and expelled frontiersmen from their property that they had already settled. So if you can imagine, you've moved your whole family from, let's say, central Pennsylvania, no, let's go Virginia, central Virginia, over the mountains. You've claimed, dozens or maybe 160, 200 acres of land. You have spent the last 2 or 3 years of your life, your children, your extended family, clearing that land. And you can imagine how long it would take to clear forests without the modern day equipment. And you've planted your first crop and you're about to have your first yield, and British soldiers show up on horseback in their fancy uniforms and say, you have to leave. You're not allowed to be here. Parliament has passed a law. You need to go back to Western Virginia. That had to have been unbelievably frustrating. Some of the settlers did what they were supposed to do. Others said, heck no. We're not going anywhere. So it was just another, as Mr. Heimler says, another check in the I don't like the British box by the colonists in the years in between the French and Indian War and the War for Independence. So make sure you know what the proclamation line of 1763 is. There's a couple of maps here on the PowerPoint that show the British territory before the war and then the British territory after the war, and that proclamation line of 1763 is clearly visible in that map. We also talked about the Paxton Boys, the Paxton attacks, which was another ramification of the French absence and the frustration with the native people. I feel like I probably shared this with you on the last video, but everything is running together with all of the kids in quarantine and whatnot, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But the Paxton attacks came out of in Pennsylvania. It is when a group of immigrant settlers decided to take matters into their own hands and expel Native American tribes in Pennsylvania, in spite of the fact that most of them were friendly. And the Quakers resigned from the boards of assembly boards, and William Penn's experiment was over with. The Indians were expelled. Okay, let's see what else. There is a PowerPoint slide here with a picture of the very first political cartoon, and it was drawn by Benjamin Franklin. And there's a picture of Benjamin Franklin on this slide as well. A little bit of a younger man than we're used to seeing him. He looks like he's still got a little bit of hair, although it's probably a wig. This is a very important thing for you to be aware of, because it very well could come up on a AP quiz, or I'm sorry, test. It's the snake, the join or die snake, and it's a snake that's in bits and pieces, kind of coiled around, and it's got the various states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, etc., labeled on it, and it says join or die. Most people associate this political cartoon with the American Revolution, and it was used during the American Revolution, but it predates the American Revolution. It was actually written for the French and Indian War. Benjamin Franklin was encouraging the 13 colonies to join together and to form a sort of a precursor to the Continental Congress called the Albany Union, or the Albany Plan of Union. And he thought it would be a great idea for the colonies to all be represented by representatives at a Congress of sorts, where they made decisions about how the colonies were going to act and function and be engaged in the French and Indian War. And so it didn't work. He created this political cartoon with the various colonies, encouraging them to come together figuratively, and then also at the Albany, New York. And the colonists really didn't want to do that, really didn't need to do that, because the British were in charge. It would have been a duplication, another layer of bureaucracy, I guess you could say, but it was a precursor to the Continental Congress that is going to come together to discuss the increasing tensions between the colonies and the British as we lead up to the Declaration of Independence. The Second Continental Congress is actually going to be the Congress that declares independence. We watched Mr. Heimler's video on the French and Indian War, and I don't recall if I've asked you to do that yet, but I would definitely watch it. It's very good. It's only like 6 minutes long, so I'll include that as well. Okay, so that kind of finishes chapter 4. We jump into chapter 5, which is a conversation about the tensions between the British after the French and Indian War, which lead to independence, and then the war itself, the American Revolution. It doesn't go into a whole lot of detail about the various battles, which you'll find a lot of history books don't do when they're more interested in the big picture, the cause and effect, and that sort of thing. But I'll probably spend a little more time on some of the battles of the American Revolution, because I think they're important. All right, next slide. You see it says Chapter 5, the American Revolution, 1763 to 1783. So this is a period of time from the end of the French and Indian War and to the end of the American Revolution, and we are in period 3. The opening pages of Chapter 5, which I think is page 175, which you should have already read, hopefully you've read, describes a scene in Boston in which the governor, Governor Hutchinson, I think he's the deputy governor actually of Boston, is toying with the idea of introducing, I think it was, I have to think about this, the Stamp Act. He actually wasn't in favor of it, but he was responsible for it, which was a tax by the British on paper products in the colonies. And it describes a scene where a mob shows up at the governor's house, and they break in, they get past the guards, and they literally destroy the entire house and pretty much everything in it. I did find a clip from a movie, a television series of this, and I showed it in class. It's from a series called The Sons of Liberty, which I think is on Netflix. I know it's on Amazon Prime. I've tried to watch it before, and I wish that I could watch it, but it gets super nasty, like ridiculously nasty and violent. And so while it tells a story, I think it tells it in a sensational way. So I can't recommend it for you to watch on your own. And I would send you the link to the clip that I showed in class, but I only show a very small part of the clip. I show a clip of the clip because there's a couple of nasty scenes in it that I'm trying to avoid. I just wanted them to see the insanity of the crowd as they broke into the governor's mansion. So I did put a picture on there. But essentially the reason that the author opens chapter 5 with this particular image is because he's trying to explain to the reader that the tensions in the colonies escalated quickly because the British decided to stop neglecting their colonies, to enforce navigation laws, and to tax them to reimburse the crown for all of the expenses associated with the French and Indian War. And honestly, they had every right to do that. The colonists were taxed at a much lower rate than probably any other part of the British Empire. And that was because we were making so much money for the crown, they probably didn't feel like they needed to. But it got to the point where they were so much in debt from all of the wars that they were involved in, they figured it was time, I'll use the expression, for the colonists to pay their fair share. And so the colonists, however, were not at all interested in paying taxes. They were very frustrated because to them it felt like Parliament was just coming up with taxes, and the colonies had no representation in Parliament. Remember, the colonists are considered English citizens, and they have all the rights and privileges of English citizenship. And one of those rights is you have a right, at least experientially, to have a representative of Parliament representing you in order to confer the right to tax you. So if I elect somebody who I send to Congress who votes for a tax, I, in effect, have given my representative permission to make those decisions on my behalf. But there were no representatives from the colonies represented in the House of Commons in Parliament. So thus, they felt kind of like this is totally not fair. They just didn't want to pay taxes. That's kind of the bottom line. Americans don't like paying taxes. So I went through a whole host of discussions about the various taxes, and I'm going to just go through this with you right now, and hopefully it will make sense in chronological order. But there's a slide that has a picture of a stamp on it with a skull and crossbones, and then several terms that you need to be familiar with. And so I actually had the class take notes on this. You can take notes on this if you want to. I'm probably also going to give a sheet later that has the definitions, but I'm gonna zip through these. So the first, I'm kind of going to go out of order a little bit, but the very first tax that was introduced after the French and Indian War was what was called the Sugar Act of 1764. And the Sugar Act was an attempt to encourage the colonists to buy sugar who originated in the Caribbean amongst British islands. The colonists were buying sugar and molasses from other European countries who had sugar plantations in the Caribbean because they were trying to avoid the import and taxes associated with it. So the Sugar Act allowed colonists to buy sugar or molasses from British ships and British islands and British plantations, and they severely lowered the tax on the sugar, so it would be less costly for the colonists to buy British sugar than to buy French or whatever sugar. So it sounded like a good thing on the surface. However, there were several other stipulations in the law that introduced strict enforcement of and prosecution of smuggling, and other things related to smuggling. And so, yeah, they could buy their sugar for a little cheaper, but in exchange, the smuggling that was very prevalent in the colonies would be punished much more strictly. People could lose their businesses. They could be sent to England to be prosecuted. And the reason they were smuggling goods is because they were trying to evade all of these navigation laws that required them to sell their goods on British ships. So they go to a British port where they're taxed. So it's all about taxes, avoiding taxes. And again, as I said before, England kind of ignored a lot of that for a long time because they were making so much money on the raw materials and exporting manufactured goods to the colonies that they didn't really worry about it. But at this point in time in history, they need the money. And so the colonists decided they weren't going to buy the British sugar, even if it was cheaper. And so they protested and threw a fit, and they boycotted British goods. And ultimately, the Sugar Act, I believe it was repealed as well. I need to go back and look at that. I can't remember for sure, so put that on hold. A year later, they introduced the Sugar Act was an indirect tax on basically an import tax. The Stamp Act of 1765 really gets everybody riled up. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase a little stamp that was like it cost a penny maybe. So if you bought a paper product or you filed a legal pamphlet or you bought a newspaper or magazine or playing cards, anything that was made from paper, you had to buy this 1 cent or whatever little stamp that you would adhere to your purchase, and that 1 cent penny would go into a fund that would support the British Army or whatever. Well, the colonists were like, I don't want to pay a tax because I'm not represented and this isn't fair, and they could see it. They could see that they were being charged a tax and they didn't want to pay it. And so it's sort of like if you go to Texas and you buy groceries and you get your receipt, there's no taxes on the food. Hurrah! You get your receipt and it just says total. If you buy groceries from Walmart in Arkansas, you have all of your various items, and then there's a subtotal with the taxes included. And you look at it, you're like, oh, I just paid 10% tax on all of the food that I just bought. It just kind of, So that's kind of how they felt. And so they boycotted, they threw a fit. They called together what was called the Stamp Congress, which is kind of important, again, a coming together of various colonies to figure out ways to resist this British tax. One of the things that came out of the Stamp Act Congress was the expression "no taxation without representation," and so that spread throughout the colonies. The Sons of Liberty eventually adopted that slogan. Sons of Liberty organizations popped up all over various large cities, primarily Boston, New York, and then they became tasked with discouraging merchants from buying British goods and from people keeping their promise that they're not going to buy British goods. And so the boycott was the most effective means by seeing the Stamp Act repealed. The British merchants in England were very frustrated because they were financially struggling, and then all of a sudden their largest market, the 13 colonies of North America, are not purchasing goods. And so the merchants of England started to just throw a stink. And eventually the Parliament and with the agreement of the King did end up repealing the Stamp Act. In fact, I've read that not a single stamp was ever sold in the colonies. They were shipped over here, but because of all the tumult, they were never used. Let me look to see if there's anything else. During the Stamp Act controversy, there was also an organization called the Committees of Correspondence that were created, and they were various people in different colonies up and down the seaboard that communicated with one another about what the British were doing and what they weren't doing, kind of like sort of like a spy network, but not exactly. And so like the Stamp Act Congress, the Albany Union, the Committees of Correspondence were all circumstances or situations in which the 13 colonies were working together as a single country. They were coming together and coordinating, or at least in theory they would have. And so again, it's a precursor to our future, the Continental Congress, and then ultimately a federal government of sorts. Okay, the last one on the underneath the Stamp Act says the Declaratory Act. So after Congress repealed the Stamp Act, they passed what's called the Declaratory Act of 1766, which in effect was simply a statement that, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act. We hear you. You're frustrated. You're angry. However, we still reserve the right to tax any of our colonial empire, and that includes the 13 colonies. We declare that we have the right to tax you if we decide to. So it was really kind of worthless, but it was a statement that they would potentially introduce a tax again. Okay, let me go to the top of that list. The Loyal Nine, I believe, if I remember correctly, they were a group of merchants in Boston that encouraged various forms of protest against tax collectors and the governor and others. The Loyal Nine were instrumental in the protest against Governor Hutchinson when his house got burned down, but they were uncomfortable with how far the mob went. So they were organized, but the mob isn't organized. Mobs can get a little crazy and out of hand. Virtual representation was the idea in England as well as in colonial America, but primarily in Great Britain or in England, that if a county or a territory in England did not have voting members, which in some cases that was true if you had poor areas where there were not landowners, that members of the House of Commons or the House of Lords, even though they didn't have voting members in that area, they still represented the people of England, even if they were not elected by certain people within certain different parts of the country. They were virtually represented just simply by the fact that the representatives in the House of Commons and the House of Lords were members of the same country. So they were virtually represented. So that was Parliament's argument to the colonists in North America, that no, you don't have any elected members of Parliament, but as a greater members of the British Empire, we virtually represent you. We are your voice, even though you didn't elect us. And so that was one of the things that they used to declare that they still could tax them. Writs of assistance. This was a warrant. It was a law that was passed by Parliament that allowed tax collectors and the king's men in the colonies to present sort of a warrant of sorts that would allow them to check ships to see if they were smuggling goods. And so it was a way of getting around the details of a search warrant. If they thought they had probable cause, they could just enter a ship. And in fact, John Hancock was a pretty well-known smuggler, avoiding British taxes and the navigation laws, and his ship, the Liberty, oh, thank you. The ship, the Liberty, was had a writ of assistance issued. I just got a Sonic drink. Thank you.
Are you teaching right now?
I am, Mr. Mosley. Say hi.
Hey, how
These
are
are
you?
my quarantine DC kids.
Keep listening and do not watch this in 2 times, okay?
Yes,
right.
watch it in a regular time. That's right. That's my freshman that did that. Although I'm sure the juniors have figured that out too. Anyway, so John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, was boarded, and they discovered that, I think it was alcohol, wine or something that he was smuggling to some of the French islands maybe. And it was impounded, and boy, did that create quite the hubbub. And then the Admiralty Courts, this again, another law was passed. What was happening is that your right as an English citizen is that you have the right to a jury trial of your peers, by your peers. So if you're charged with something, some people who represent your people sit on the jury and listen to the case against you and decide whether or not you're guilty or not guilty. Well, as you can imagine in Boston, I'm just going to use Boston as an example. If John Hancock is arrested for smuggling and he is charged in a court and he sits through a trial, all of his buddies are going to be sitting on the jury and they're going to find him not guilty. And so the British were having a heck of a time prosecuting anybody for some of this illegal activity because the jury would not find them guilty. And so they thought, well, we're going to have to try them elsewhere. And so there was a loophole in the law that allowed, if a judge was a traveling judge and traveled by ship, the court case, the trial could actually take place on the ship out of convenience for the judge, and it did not require a jury. That's how I understand it. And so I believe that this law allowed them to prosecute smugglers and other people in the colonies violating laws on the ship, so they didn't have a jury trial, or sent to England where they would have a trial with a jury, but the jury was not inclined to find them not guilty simply because they were neighbors. So anyway, I think that exhausts the list here. So let me zip down a smidgen here. All right, so French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, Proclamation Line of 1763, Sugar Act of 1764, Stamp Act of 1765. Then we're going to have the Townshend Acts, which were more import taxes, and then we're going to have the Tea Act, which is going to culminate. Let me see here. I totally missed something kind of important. Okay, so. In 1770, as tensions were rising as a result of all of this hubbub about taxes, in Boston, there were a large number of redcoats, sometimes referred to as lobsters by the colonists, that lived in Boston, were housed in people's homes in Boston, competed for jobs on the fishing docks and whatnot with Bostonians. They oftentimes were stationed near the import offices or duty offices, tax imports. And on this particular night, I think it was in March of 1770, it was still a cold night in Boston. A group of frustrated Bostonians came up and started taunting a group of soldiers in front of the tax office. And the British soldiers began to kind of fear for their lives. They were getting things thrown at them, snowballs, rope from the fishing docks, which, I mean, if you pelted it at them, it could hurt them. And somebody was screaming fire, like fire, basically tempting them to fire into the crowd. And one of the British soldiers discharged his weapon, which caused all of them to discharge their weapons. And I believe 5 Bostonians were killed. You know the story. Paul Revere, a few days later, I think maybe even a month later, recreated the story and makes the British soldiers look like they just fired indiscriminately into the crowd, which they did, but I think they truly were afraid for their life. The mob was getting, kind of like with Hutchinson's home. And so 5 people were killed. One of them, Crispus Attucks, is the one that you hear his name bantered around a lot. He was of African Indian white descent, I believe. He died that night, and the event was portrayed as another incursion or violation of the British upon the citizens of Boston. So it just really exasperated the situation. The Sons of Liberty got very involved in this. This image was reproduced and sent to all of the colonies, so it was quite offensive. John Adams, who was a lawyer at the time in Boston, was asked to represent the soldiers, the British soldiers, and after he did some interviews and talked to different people who were there, he concluded that the British officers had acted in self-defense, that they really were fearful for their lives, and he was able to get some people to testify to that extent, and 7 of the 9 soldiers were found not guilty. 2 of them were found guilty of manslaughter, so accidentally killing, and they were sent back to England, and I don't think they even served any time. It was a successful trial for John Adams. However, kind of put him on the wrong side of the story because people thought that the British soldiers were murderers. So it kind of got John Adams off to a rough start. And then we watched a clip from the John Adams series. I will see if I can find that. The Boston massacre scene, and I'll include that in the lesson. All right, so from there, Thursday lesson popped up, and we had writing prompts on Tuesday and writing prompts on Thursday. So for the 3 of you that were not here on Tuesday, I think that's right, 1, 2, 3. I think there were 3 of you gone, maybe 4. If you weren't here on Tuesday, I want you to do all of the writing prompts. I think there's 4 of them. And you can use your books or whatever to write them. But since you weren't here for the discussion, I want you to go ahead and do all of them. And then, let's see here. I'll put a Google Doc with the questions there. And then the next lesson, the students were supposed to read pages 185 to 196. And it was a little bit of a train wreck because of the short class, and we really didn't get to it in time. And so I had them do the writing prompts at the beginning of the class from that section. And that section covers it covers the battles of Lexington and Concord. It covers conversation about the beginnings of the American independence movement, and then Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and then the announcement of independence from England. So we didn't get too far. We talked about the timeline a little bit, and so I'm just going to share with you what I talked about related to Lexington and Concord, and then we started to watch the John Adams movie, which covers the debate on independence. And so the timeline is on this PowerPoint as well. And so Boston Massacre happens in 1770. In 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act was passed, which required colonists to purchase tea only from the East India Trading Company, which operated over in the Indian and Spice Islands over there. I think predominantly on the subcontinent of India. Anyhow, they were in bankruptcy, and a lot of wealthy members of parliament and other important people in Great Britain were losing a lot of cash. And so Parliament and the Crown thought it would be a great idea to require colonists to purchase tea only from the East India Trading Company. And so they sent shiploads of tea to the major ports in North America. And all of them refused to disembark. They wouldn't let the ship even get the tea off the boat. They sent them away, except for the governor or the mayor of Boston. He was a crownsman. He said, we will unload the tea, and we will take it into town, and we will require merchants to sell this tea and no other tea. And so the Sons of Liberty had organized an event if the vote went against them, and if the governor or the mayor, whichever it was, decided to require them to sell the tea. And since the governor did require them to sell the tea, the crowds, Samuel Adams, who was the head of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, gave a nod to his people. His people were dressed as Indians. They marched down towards the docks, and with crowds cheering them on, they dumped about $4 or $5 million worth of tea into the Boston harbor. Of course, that was disastrous. And for the relationship between the Crown and the people of Boston in particular. And so the king and parliament decide to shut down Boston Harbor until the people of Boston pay back the $4 or $5 million that they now owe the East India Trading Company. And the king, Parliament in Great Britain lost a lot of money on the deal because Boston was one of their busiest ports in all of their empires. And so to shut that port down was a pretty dramatic decision. It was called the Coercive Acts. And essentially the Coercive Act said, when you pay back the money and you do this and that, we will reopen the harbor. The colonists called it the Intolerable Acts. And so the port closes, people lose their jobs. Boston kind of goes under the cloud of the British Navy, who are now parked in Boston Harbor, and everything's super tense. A few months go by, the harbor is still closed. Bostonians are not paying the money to pay back that tea. They're not going to do it. And so a network of riders were organized to keep an eye on the British Navy. There were several pockets of militia that were storing up ammunition and other things to protect themselves against the British if they needed it. One of those towns was Concord, which is a few miles outside of Boston. Sam Adams and John Hancock both had warrants out for their arrest, and they were in hiding in a little town called Lexington. They were living in the church's, what's it called? Can't think of when the pastor has a house associated with the church. So they were living basically in the pastor's house, waiting for word about what was happening in Boston. And so the point of signal was the Old North Church, which had the highest steeple that could be seen for the farthest outside of Boston. And there was a signal that was to be used if the British were coming off their boats and coming into Boston, or if they were sailing up, I think the James River, no, I can't remember the name of the river there. Anyhow, were they going to sail up the river and then unload? Everybody was keeping an eye on them, and there was a network of horse riders, messengers that were waiting for that signal. And so in April of 1775, the lights in the Old North Church lit up, and the riders knew that the British had sailed out of the harbor up the river a bit, and that they were on foot and they were marching towards Lexington. And so these riders dispersed all across the countryside in Massachusetts, warning people, the British are on the march. The British are on the march. You need to take arms or protect yourself. They're heading your way. And so John Hancock and Sam Adams got word that the British were heading towards them to arrest them. And so they snuck off in the night by horseback into the woods. And then, I think that that's correct. And then the town of Concord in particular, where a lot of the weapons were being hidden, they managed to round up all of the various places they had stored stuff and dispersed it. So as the British are marching towards Lexington, the Minutemen of Lexington, which were men that were trained, they were just regular townsfolk that were trained to protect the town if they needed to. That's why in a minute's notice, that's why they're called the Minutemen. They had lined across the green area of Lexington, which is an open space, kind of like the size of maybe a soccer field, where they trained and they had town events and stuff. And they were standing in the green when the British regiments approached. The British warned them they needed to disperse, they needed to get out of the way. They did not move. And so the British say that somebody in the militia fired a shot. The militia say that someone in the British Army fired a shot, but somebody fired a shot, probably the British. And in spite of urban legend, the Minutemen did not stand and fight. They actually, after the shot was fired, and then more shots were fired, they dispersed rapidly. They left the scene. There was nothing they could really do against, hundreds of redcoats. And so there were several Minutemen that were shot and killed. John Hancock and Sam Adams were long gone, so the British Army continued on to Concord. When they got to Concord, they discovered that the ammunition had been moved and that they had been ratted out, and they were furious. And so in response to that, they just started lighting buildings on fire. They were lighting up barns and other things, destroying personal property, which is, again, a violation of an Englishman's rights. And while they were doing that, word was spreading all over the Massachusetts countryside that the British Army had just killed a number of the Lexington Minutemen. They were burning people's homes, and farmers grabbed their hunting rifles and their pitchforks, and they began to line the road that took the British were going to take all their way back to Boston that night. And so in the wee hours of the morning, and probably from about midnight on, as the British marched back towards Boston, they were fired at over and over and over again from the woods and the trees. They were sitting ducks, basically. And I believe that I read somewhere that over 300 of them were killed or wounded. And so, war hasn't even been declared yet. Independence hasn't even been declared yet. But it is open range open fighting on the British. And so by the time they got back to Boston, it was very clear to everybody that war was in the air. Put your finger up and be like, whew, we got some serious trouble coming our way. And so the Continental Congress is going to meet to, actually they're already meeting at this point. I actually want to save that conversation for another time, but Congress is meeting in Philadelphia to discuss the rising tensions between the British and the colonists, in particular in Massachusetts, in Boston, where a lot of the hubbub was taking place. So I think I'm going to end it there. That's plenty long. It's almost 50 minutes long. Follow the directions in Google Classroom. Answer, there will be a total of 7 writing prompts. I know that's a lot, but I cannot duplicate actually being in class. And so I want to make sure you don't fall behind. So by answering each of those questions, you will be able to experience a little bit of the engagement we have in class together. I think that's it. I'm going to try to upload this to YouTube. I will see you guys, hopefully every single one of you, on Monday. Bye.